Okay, we're back and we're going to talk more about Medicare and supplemental and other things involving Medicare. Okay, we talked about these and let's move on. Finer details. Think of Medicare primarily as being hospital, although it also covers other different types of things, skilled nursing facility stays, hospice care, both inpatient and outpatient, and some home health care. And again, we always think of submitting the UB04 for facility charges, but we may also be submitting the CMS 1500 form for any professional service. Excuse me. Part B is medical office. This includes physician or other qualified practitioners, any outpatient care, home health, durable medical equipment, mental health services, and other services. These all go on the 1500 form. When we use the term coinsurance, we're talking about again, how does coinsurance play out? Means that the hospitals can charge patients either 20% of the charges or the higher national median coinsurance amount. Medicare gets to reimburse hospitals the difference between the Medicare approved amount and the national coinsurance of 20%. If hospitals collect the higher median coinsurance amount from the patient, Medicare reduces its reimbursement by the same amount. With the copayment, Medicare allows patients to pay either the coinsurance or a fixed copayment, whichever is less. Again, Part C, which is a growing area for health information management professionals, this is a big one. So they estimated in Oregon upwards to 35% of all Medicare patients have Medicare Advantage. And again, there are no claim forms. It covers both inpatient and outpatient. There is some drug coverage, but there are special carve-outs for certain specialty drugs. And to join, you basically enroll in Medicare Part A and B, and you live within the planned service area. So if you're a Kaiser Permanente member living in Oregon, you have to live in the states of either Oregon or Washington to be eligible for that coverage. And again, with Part C, the way they keep the cost down is if that's the case, you can only get your care from a Kaiser Permanente Northwest region provider. And again, no claim forms. There are some separate carve-outs or specialty care. For instance, if you have coverage and a provider isn't in the area, but for the most part, this is pretty seamless to the Medicare patient and the medical office. Part D, of course, is the prescription drug plan, and this is optional. You pay into it like any other type of optional insurance. And people can have it deducted direct from their Social Security check if they're drawing Social Security. And the idea is you get discounted medications. There are other Medicare plans available. They're Medicare cost plans. There's the PACE, medication therapy management programs, all these different types of things that are out there. We also have Medicare savings programs. So basically with these groups, they pay the Medicare Part A, Part B, or Part C premium and pick up the deductibles, the co-pays, the co-insurance, what have you. And again, these are all of these are things that the Medicare patient can opt in. Something that you've heard about in other classes are the accountable care organizations. And basically, this is a way of bridging the continuum of care to include medical offices, hospitals, home health, to work together to improve care for people with the original Medicare. So the idea is that these accountable care organizations enter into CMS and they take responsibility for the quality of care, regardless of whether they're seen in the medical office setting, the hospital, or what have you. And these are undergoing further refinement with the pathways to success and more of an emphasis on quality care. They want to see certain quality markers met. The idea is to not just provide care, but to provide higher quality care. Now we also have the Medigap insurance. These are supplemental insurance, and these are offered by Blue Cross Blue Shield, Secure Horizons, some of these other ones, QualMed, and basically they cover a portion of the gap that Medicare doesn't pay for, right? And they're not available everywhere across the board. So depending on your geographic location, certain Medigap insurance plans are not available to people. Here's an example of how that pays out. Note up here, Part A, we have 100, Part B, all these other things over here. Part A hospice, and then we get into some of these other things that have gaps, right? So basically, this is a way of protecting the patient, well, particularly seniors, while they're on a fixed income. And again, similar to many HMOs, Medicare only allows payment for services and supplies that are reasonable and necessary. They do not cover procedures deemed to be experimental or investigational in nature, right? So even if somebody's in a clinical trial for oncology, the only thing that Medicare will pay for and reimburse for is the services that the patient would have received anyway. So now we get into the interesting area of participating, non-participating, and opt-out providers. Part B is based on what type of relationship the provider, nor many times the physician, has with Medicare. And there are three main types. They're either participating as a provider, they're non-participating, or they opted out. Let's talk about some of these. With participating, they're accepting the assignment on all claims, right? And we want to increase the number of participating providers. And to do that, we do direct payment of all claims. We have bonuses for the Medicare, the MACs, to recruit and enroll participating providers. We have a directory to the patients. We have a message on all unassigned Medicare summary notices to patients, reminding them of reducing the out-of-pocket expenses that the participating providers using and how much they would have saved by using a participating provider. And the claims get processed faster. So a lot of incentive for participating providers. With some practices, think cardiothoracic surgery, they pretty much have to be participating providers or they are going to see a dramatic loss in revenue. Non-participating providers accept assignment on a claim by claim basis, but there are restrictions. The patient has to file all the Medicare claims. There are fees that limit the charges on non-assigned claims. We can't bill the patient for the balance. So they pay for it, there's still a gap. You can't hit the patient for that. The collections are only for the deductibles and the coinsurance that are due, right? And the patient has to sign an advance beneficiary notice of non-coverage for anything that's non-assigned for a surgical fee over $500 and accept whatever the assignment is on the charges. So again, the idea being that we want them to see participating providers. Then finally, we have the opt-out. The opt-out does not accept Medicare, but they have an agreement to be excluded from Medicare. They can charge whatever they want. And Medicare only pays for the services from opt-out providers for emergencies, and the patient is responsible for the cost of care received. Both the providers and the suppliers have to submit the claims for all services if the patient is enrolled in Part B. With the advanced beneficiary notice of non-coverage, the ABN, this is a document that gets given to a Medicare beneficiary by a provider, physician office, prior to the service being given. And it indicates that the service is unlikely to be reimbursed by Medicare. And it's stating why Medicare is likely not to pay for it. And the beneficiary is responsible for the payment if Medicare denies the claim. And this is where the last bullet point is important for anybody who's ever worked in a medical office. If the beneficiary did not sign the advanced beneficiary notice of non-coverage, the provider cannot bill the MAC or the beneficiary. And that's all I have for you. Come back for the next talk where we'll be looking at Medicare as a primary, Medicare as a secondary, and other topics. We'll see you then.